At the end of the summer of 1896, large amounts of gold were found in the Yukon River Basin. And it was a year later that when a prospector returned from discovering gold in the Yukon. In fact, he returned to Seattle with what would be in today's value $20 to $30 million of gold. And when news traveled around the country about that, it set off what is known today as the Klondike Gold Rush. Over 100,000 people uprooted their lives, left their former lives behind, and made their way for the Yukon. Now, to get there, it was quite an arduous journey. First of all, as you can see here in these pictures, you had to board a ship from Seattle, and then you had to sail to one of two ports. Either you had to sail to Skagway in Canada, or you had to sail to the port of Valdez in Alaska. And then from those two ports, it was a hundreds of mile, 500, 600 mile journey at that point that you would have to take. And you would have to travel through and over mountains, cross glaciers, huge crevasses, blizzards, freezing temperatures, just to get to where this gold was discovered. Now just think about the risk that these people took, all in the hopes and the allure of riches and wealth. Now that's where we left the story last week. What happened to these 100,000 people that made their way for the Yukon? Well, history tells us that of those 100,000 that were going, the majority of them never even made it to the gold fields, the river basin. Sadly, some of those ships never made it to port. Also, most of the people that made this trip, they weren't professional mountaineers. They weren't professional prospectors. They didn't have enough gear. They didn't have enough supplies. Many died in accidents. Others froze to death. Others starved from lack of supplies. And history tells us this, that the truth is only about 30,000 of the 100,000 eventually made it to the gold fields and set up a claim. They began to actually try to find gold there in the Klondike. But of those 30,000 that actually made it, only about 10%, 3,000, actually ever found any gold at all. And the truth is, the vast majority of those people that found gold, they found just enough to live and keep looking for more. Or many of them wasted the gold that they found and turned it into money and wasted it in the saloons and the brothels that popped up in these mining towns. When it was all said and done, only about 200 people actually got wealthy and rich from the Klondike Gold Rush. Now just think about that. 100,000 wealth seekers, and only 200 people actually found it. The vast majority of the people did not have their hopes and their dreams realized when it came to wealth. And I think it's the same way today. I think most people don't get the kind of life they want, they dreamed of, they hoped for when it comes to wealth and money. And I think the reason for that is because most of us follow what's typical, what's normal, what everybody else does, what the average person does when it comes to how we handle our money. I want to welcome all of our congregations and churches joining us today. My name is James. It's an honor to be with you and to have all of our congregations online sharing in this message and in this moment together. Now, last week, if you were with us, I gave us 3 typical attitudes that most people have when it comes to money. And I just want to quickly review those, and then we're going to spend most of our time on the 3 atypical attitudes that Jesus gives us that I think can lead us to the kind of life we all want when it comes to finances and money. A life that is lived freely, responsibly, and generously. But let's start with, let me refresh you with those 3 typical attitudes we talked about last week. The first one is this. I think most people think more money will make me more happy. Now, I know that's not grammatically incorrect, but it sure is the way most of us think, right? Like, I think most of us think that, man, happiness is just around the corner, right? I mean, happiness, it's when I just get that next pay raise, when I hit that next income bracket, when I can get that next car or that next house or that next hobby or that next adventure or whatever it is, that it's just out there. If I can just get there, I'll find it. And as we said last week, there's nothing wrong with making more money, or the truth is, making a lot of money. But it won't fill your soul, and it won't settle your anxious heart. Only God can do that. Typical attitude number 2, this is what we said last week. A lot of people think this: all the church is interested in is my money. And I want to remind you what I said last week, that in this church, what we are most interested in is ministry. That's what we're interested in. We exist to serve and to give ourselves away just like Jesus did. We are about positive impact in our community and change lives on the other side of our serving and the other side of our giving. And this is what our Christmas offering is all about. I shared with you last week how much we have given over the last decade. We've done the Christmas offering for 11 years, and in its first decade, what this Christmas offering has done is absolutely astonishing. Now, if you're new to our community, the Christmas offering, it is a yearly offering that we give at the end of the year. It's kind of like our Christmas gift to Jesus, and it is over and above our regular giving, and it funds all of our mission and outreach work in the coming year. And what we have done, what that offering does is pretty incredible, and I would encourage you to read all about it. You can go to thechristmasoffering.com, and you can watch some videos, and you can see our partnerships. And what the Christmas offering does is it supports ministries here, near, and far, locally, regionally, and globally. It educates and cares for orphans and children in poverty overseas in Africa, specifically an orphanage that we support that you might have heard about earlier today in Uganda. It builds homes for families in desperate poverty across the border. It serves the hungry and the homeless in our own communities where our churches are. It serves those that are in prison, helps people in rehab. It starts new churches to reach new people in new communities, and a whole lot more. And in the first 10 years, here's what we have given and really given away. In the first 10 years of this offering, we've given $5,270,417.26. And you know what we did with all that? We gave it away. Ministry, impact, change lives. That's what we are about in this church. And that's why we're inviting everybody. 100% of all those who are part of our church family, whether at a physical location or online, to give to the Christmas offering this year. Here's what we all know: the needs in our world and in our community, they are greater than ever before. And so we are praying and believing that the Christmas offering is going to be bigger than ever before so we can meet those needs. We're all about the ministry. And then here's typical attitude number 3. Again, this is what I think most people think when it comes to money, right? It's my money. And because of that, I can do whatever I want with it, right? Hey, it's mine, and I can do whatever I want with it. Well, you know what? People in Jesus' day had a very similar attitude when it comes to money, that it was theirs, and they could do whatever they want with it. And so what Jesus did to kind of push back on this attitude and this mentality is he told a story in Matthew chapter 25. And from this story, we're going to look at now, and this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time, 3 atypical, different, not normal attitudes when it comes to money. And I just want to encourage you to really lean into these, because here's the reality. If you want what most people don't have when it comes to how they live financially, you're going to have to do things that most people don't do. You're going to have to think in ways that most people don't think. And this is what Jesus offers us through this story today. Jesus is teaching, and he constantly says things like this. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like. In other words, the ways of living in God's kingdom, in God's ways, they're a little bit different. And to help people understand what living in God's kingdom, living in God's ways is like, Jesus most often told stories, parables, a short story with a point or multiple points. And that's what Jesus does here. And so Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like, and here's where we left it last week. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey, Jesus says, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he, the owner, went on his journey. Now, right up front in the story, let me just ask this question. Whose wealth was it? Was it the owner's or was it the servants'? Yeah, obviously, it was the owner's wealth. What did he do? At the beginning of the story, the owner entrusted his money to them, and then he left them responsible for it, and he went on a trip. So right at the beginning of the story, Jesus is introducing us to atypical attitude number 1. And here's atypical attitude number 1. I am not an owner, but a manager of God's money. Now, I know that is a crazy atypical attitude. But if we are going to live the way I think we want to live and God wants us to live, this is how it starts. Where we look at our resources, we look at our life, and we say, I am not an owner, but I am a manager of God's money. The 3 servants in the story were managers. They were stewards of the owner's resources that he had given them. And friends, that's why every financial decision is a spiritual decision. Did you know that? That every financial decision that you or I make, it is a spiritual decision. Why? Because we're making decisions with resources that aren't ours. They're his. We are just the managers. We're the stewards of the resources that God has entrusted to us. Now again, I know this is a crazy way to look at and think about our resources, but I'll tell you this, it's a freeing way to view our resources. And this is important for us to understand, because if you're a Jesus follower, understanding this is so important, because if you want God to bless this area of your life, I mean, if you're watching this today, I have to believe at some level you want God to bless every area of your life, but God can only bless the areas of our life that we give him control over. And so if we want God to bless us financially, guess what? He has to be in control. We have to be submitted to him when it comes to our finances. Let's go back to the Jesus story and see what these 3 different servants did. Let's keep reading. Here's what it says. Jesus said, the man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and he put his money to work, and he gained 5 bags more. So also, the one with 2 bags of gold, gained 2 more. But the man who had received just 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now, at this point, I think we can all figure out the metaphors that Jesus is giving in this story. Obviously, the owner in this story represents God. And he's the one that provides everything we have. He's the one that gives us our ability to earn. Our very ability to work is a gift from him. And God has put on loan to us a certain amount of stuff, a certain amount of money, a certain amount of resources. Now, just like this story, we don't all have the same amount of resources, do we? Some of us have a lot, 5 bags. Some of us have a little, 1 bag. Some of us, right in the middle. Kind of, we don't have a lot, we don't have a little. Maybe we just have just enough. But the point of the story that I think we can already see is that Jesus is saying, whatever you have, a lot, a little, or somewhere in between, whatever you have is a gift from God. And how you use his resources that he's given you, it definitely matters. And that leads us to atypical attitude number 2. If you're taking notes today, you can type this in or write it down. I'm responsible to advance the owner's goals, not my own. I mean, if God's the owner and everything I have has been given to me by him, then I'm responsible to advance the owner's goals, not just my own. And in Jesus' story, what did the first two servants do? They invested, they put the owner's resources to work, and they got a return. And what did the third one do? Out of fear, maybe out of some laziness, he played it safe, and he did what he wanted, and he just buried it in the ground. When I was in college and back in high school, my last summer after high school, I had a summer job for 3 years where I worked for a large a real estate company in my hometown, and I worked in the property maintenance department of that real estate company. Now, my hometown is where the University of Illinois is located. Every fall, 50,000 college students descend on my hometown and live there until the next May. They go home for Christmas break and then usually a week of spring break, but they're there in my town. So here's what that means. There's a lot of real estate. There's a lot of condos. There's a lot of apartments that those students take up. And so this company in the summer would hire a whole lot of workers, high school, college-age kids like me, to go into all of these apartments that college kids had lived in and refurbish them before the next school year. Now, I'm sure you can only imagine, or you can think back to when you were in school, how college kids treat apartments. Let's just say I don't think any of them ever got their deposit back. And so my job and my team's job was that we would go into these apartments and then we would follow the list of, usually it was landscaping out front, painting either the whole place or part of it, ripping out the carpet, or maybe shampooing, washing the carpet. But here's the thing. When I walked into those apartments, I didn't do what I wanted to do. It wasn't my decision what carpet got replaced and what carpet got shampooed. It wasn't my decision what walls were just touched up and what walls were repainted, what holes were left and what holes were repaired. No, it was the owner's decision. When we walked in, for every apartment, we already had a list where the owner said, this is what I want to do in this apartment. This one is just touch-up paint. This one is total paint. This one is shampoo the carpets. This one is rip them all out. I was serving the owner's goals and the owner's agenda every day I went to work. And so let me ask you a question. How about you? Whose goals are you advancing with your resources? Just yours? I mean, do you view everything that comes to you as just for you? Or do you view yourself as a manager, as a steward, who is advancing the owner's goals, not just your own? You see, every time I worship God and I give through our local church, and my wife and I do that twice a month, every time we get paid. She works, she's a labor and delivery nurse, and so every time she gets paid and every time I get paid, we worship God through giving first. And every time I do that, what I'm doing is I'm participating in God's kingdom work, his ministry through our local church, in our community, and in our world. I'm choosing to be part of advancing God's kingdom agenda and his kingdom goals, not just my own. Now, let's go back to the Jesus story and see what happens with these three servants. Here's how Jesus concluded the story. Jesus said, after a long time, in other words, the owner was gone for a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled his accounts with them. Now, just go back one if you guys could on the screen there. Settled his accounts with them. What just happened here? Well, there was a day of accountability, right? The owner entrusted his workers with his wealth. And there was a day where he was coming back to say, hey, what did you do with my money? With what I gave you? Now, I'm going to skip ahead in the story in just a second. If you want to read it in its entirety on your own. But here's what happened. The two that had doubled the owner's money, that had put it to work and invested it. Remember these two guys? The one that had gotten 5 bags and the one that had gotten 2 bags or 3 bags. What happened to them? Well, they had doubled the money, and so they brought it before the owner, and then look at what the owner said to them. The master replied to both those 2 that had invested and doubled his money. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Now just leave it right there. What just happened? The ones that had invested it, had put it to work for the master's goals, the master's agenda. What happened to them? They were blessed and they received more. That's what happened to them. But what happened to the servant that had just 1 bag and he showed back up with just 1 bag? He had just buried it in the ground. What did the master say to him? Well, I'm glad you asked. Look at what Jesus said. His master replied to that one, you wicked and lazy servant. And then to the guards nearby, he said, so take the bag of gold from him, the lazy servant, and give it to the one who has 10 bags. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now that's not a Jesus story where it all ends happily ever after for everyone, is it? Well, what is Jesus saying here? Well, again, I think you can see it. The point of this story at the end is this stark contrast between these 2 different types of servants, one known as the lazy servant and the other 2 profitable servants. Jesus is letting us know that a day of accountability is coming when the master will ask us what we did with the resources we've been given. Not just our money, our life, our stuff, our time, our talents. What did we do? Did we just play it safe? Did we just spend them all on ourselves? Did we bury ourselves in our job? Did we bury ourselves in our house, in our kids' activities, in our hobbies? Or did we invest ourselves and our resources in God's kingdom purposes too? And the reality is we all have a day of accountability coming where we are going to stand before God and we are going to have to give an account of how we used what he gave us here in this life. And in that moment, friends, we're all standing on our own. I can't answer for you and you can't answer for me. What did I do with what God gave me? But I'll tell you what, I can answer that question collectively for our entire church network. As the pastor, lead pastor of our church network, I can tell you this. We are not going to be the lazy servant in this story. We are not going to play it safe and just bury God's resources in the ground until this pandemic is over. We're just going to sit back and, oh man, once this is done, then we'll be able to do real ministry again. No, we're not going to do that. What are we going to do? We're going to be the profitable servants. We're going to take what God has given us, investing it and using it in God's kingdom work to make a difference and reach people for Christ. And we've been doing that since the beginning of this pandemic. We're going to continue to be adaptable and flexible and faithful. We're going to keep starting and trying new things, whether that be with our kids, our students, or our adults. We're not going to sit back and just bury God's resources in the ground and wait for better days. No, we're going to meet people in their point of need right now during these days. That's what this story is all about. And I'm asking you to join me. If you are a Jesus follower and this is your church, give faithfully and regularly. Trust God with your money. And that leads to this last atypical attitude. Atypical attitude number 3, if you're taking notes. I demonstrate who the owner is by honoring the owner first. I demonstrate who the owner is by honoring the owner first. My wife, Rebecca, and I have been atypical, different, weird, kind of crazy in how we handle our money for now 23 years of marriage. I don't have the time today to list all the weird, crazy, atypical ways that we handle our resources. but I want to give you our system. I want to share with you kind of the foundation, the main principle that has driven the way that we handle resources for 23 years. And it has allowed us to have and do different things without going into debt. It's allowed us to be more generous than we ever thought possible. And if you've been around in our network or in our church, I have taught this literally dozens and dozens of times. And so I just want to give it to you today because, again, it is the foundation for how I live when it comes to money. And it's super complicated, so I want you to watch really close and try to follow along. Are you ready? Here it is. Every time my wife or I, and I mentioned she works, she's a labor and delivery nurse, so every time her or I get paid, here's what we do. There's 10 of these here. Every time we get 10 or more of these, here's what we do. We give the first one or more to God. Then we save the second one or more for ourselves, for our future. And then, look at all that. We live on the rest. We do whatever we want with all of this. Now again, I know that was really, really complicated, so let me just do it again because I want to make sure you get this. This is what has driven my life and how I live, how I give, how I save for the last 23 years. Here's what I do. Every time that I get 10 of these, every single time, doesn't matter if I get a lot of these or just 10 of these. I get 10, 100, 10,000, 100,000, whatever I get, every time I get these, I take one or more, to at least 10%, and I give it back to God first. Then I take at least another 10%, oftentimes more, and I give it to ourselves. I save it for the future. And then with all of this, guess what I do? I go absolutely crazy and I do whatever I want with all of this. That's what I do. And it's been the foundation of how I have lived before I was married for a couple years and then since. So for 25 years now, that's what I've done. And it's real simple. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. Here's what I do. I give, I save, I live on the rest. In that order. I give, I save, I live on the rest. Now, I know that that is atypical. That's not normal. Because what's normal in our society, and sadly, what's even normal in the church for most Christians, is most Christians live in reverse order. Most of us spend first. Then if we ever get around to it, usually not till we're older and we wish we had started earlier, we'll save second. And then if there happens to be anything left over, and there rarely is, we will give last. That's what's typical. That's what's normal for most people. But here's the problem. As Christians, when we live that way, when we give last, when we give God the leftovers, here's what we're saying. God, you're not first, you're last. God, I'm the priority, my kingdom, my agenda, not yours. Now, here's what I know. None of us are saying that intentionally. But if we're completely honest, it's true. And I don't say that to make any of us feel guilty. Hear me clearly. I say that and I point that out and I bring that up because I want to help you live the kind of life that I think you want to live when it comes to your money. I think you want to live freely, not in fear. I think you want to live responsibly, prepared for the future because you save. And I think you want to live generously towards other people, and I think you want to live obediently towards God. And so here's the challenge that I'm issuing this week. It's really an invitation. If you're a Jesus follower and you're watching this, here's my challenge. I challenge you, invite you to live out my financial system through the rest of the year. Just through the rest of the year. You got like a month and a half. And every time you get paid, you give one or more to God first, percentage giving. You give one or more to yourself, saving. And maybe at this point you would say, man, I have too much debt. And so maybe instead of saving, you use this one to pay down debt. And then you live on the rest. You have an amazing Christmas, even during COVID. I mean, you do whatever you want to do with all of this. And I want to challenge you to do that, to put God first, to acknowledge him as the owner, to invest in what he is doing and watch him bless your life and change your heart. Now, I know because of just what's gone on with this pandemic and shutdowns, that there are many of you watching right now, that this economy and shutdowns and everything going on with COVID, it's hurt your business or it's hurt your industry, or maybe even you've lost your job. I've talked to multiple business owners in our church this week that as our county slips into another color, that they're going to have to close their businesses or massively reduce their ability to serve people and pay for their employees and all of those things. And so right now you're hearing this, and what I want you to hear, if you're in a place where you go, man, I can't give, you're in a place where you need to receive. And I want to let you know that I care and your church cares and we want to help. And a way that you could let us know that if you are in need as we are, approaching the end of the year and Thanksgiving and Christmas and all of these things, that if you're in need, let us know that. Since the beginning of this pandemic, if you go to our homepage at any of our church locations, whether that be Venice or Torrey Pines or Imperial Beach or Chula Vista or Playas or wherever you attend, if you go to our homepage, probably the third or fourth thing, if you scroll down, here's what you'll see. It will say COVID-19 care. And there's a button there that says get help. And if you'll let us know how we can help, how we could serve you and your family, we would be honored to do that. That's what the church is. It's a family. And that means that sometimes you're on the receiving end, and other times you're on the giving end. And so let me talk to others of you that the truth is during COVID and during this pandemic, your business has actually increased. Your industry is doing fine. Maybe it's even growing. You've received raises and bonuses this season. And if that is you, here's what I want to remind you. Those are gifts from God. You don't need to feel bad about them. You don't need to feel guilty about it. But you also don't need to hoard it all for yourself. Give to God first. Recognize who your source is. Worship him, acknowledging where it comes from. And then be generous. And then enjoy what God has given you. I just believe this is going to be a great holiday season, even in the midst of crazy COVID. Why? Because we have the opportunity to serve and give to others the way Jesus has served and given to us. And so I want to let you know, I'm praying for you. I'm praying that God blesses you. I'm praying that his favor rests on you and your children, that he gives you all the strength that you and I need to endure the challenges and the difficulties of this season. And at the same time, that we will be individuals and we will be a network of churches that doesn't bury what God has given us in the ground out of fear, but rather we take it and we put it to work and we invest it in God's kingdom agenda. Why? To tell his story and to give him glory. And that's what we're going to do. That's what our congregations and churches are going to do during the season. And I'm inviting you to join me in doing the same. We're going to receive communion together today as we close this message and close this experience. I want you to grab those communion elements. You can just grab any sort of drink or juice or wine, any sort of bread or cracker that you have available. I'm going to lead us in doing these together, but just go ahead and get those close by or get them in your hands if you already have them ready. And the reason I want us to receive communion every week as we're talking about generosity is because I want the basis of our generosity to others to come from a place of realizing God's generosity towards us. And that's what communion is all about. that God bankrupted heaven, that he sent Jesus. It's what we're going to celebrate at Christmas, the birth of Christ. That God sent Jesus. Why? To show us new ways of living and new ways of loving, and ultimately to be the one final for all sacrifice for our sins. That's the gift that God has given us. That's how generous God has been to us. And when we come to the Lord's table, communion, we practice open communion. All are welcome to participate in this moment. If you're a believer, you want to remember what Christ has done for you. The bread representing Christ's body, beaten and broken, so that ours can be made whole. The cup representing his blood poured out to cover your sin and mine once for all. What a good, gracious, generous God we have. And may that be the foundation of our generosity. Not guilt, not manipulation, but realizing how much we have been given. God, therefore, we want to be people like you who give. I want to invite us to take a moment of silence, a moment of reflection. I want you to consider God's goodness and God's grace to you today. He loves you. He wants to welcome you into his presence. If this whole church thing is new, he wants to welcome you into his family. Jesus is for all, not an exclusive group. And if you want to say yes to Christ, right in the silence of this moment, you say, Jesus, I'm saying yes to you. If you want to put Christ first in your finances, you pray that in this moment. Jesus, I really want you to be first in this area of my life. I'm going to choose to trust you. Thank you for your generosity to me. Let's take a moment of silence, then I'll lead us in eating the bread and drinking the cup together. If you'll go ahead and take the bread in your hands. At the very first communion, Christ took bread and he broke it and said, this is my body broken for you. Let's eat the bread and remember the generosity of Jesus to us. Next, Christ took a cup of wine and said, this is the new covenant. In other words, a new promise. My blood poured out for you. Let's drink the cup and remember the generosity of Jesus. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for your generosity to us in Christ. We thank you for the gift of communion, something tangible to touch, to taste, something physical to remind us of the great sacrifice that Christ gave that changed the spiritual landscape for everybody, that all are welcome into Christ's family, into God's family through Jesus and Jesus alone. That through the cross we have forgiveness of sin. Through the resurrection we have the promise of new life. And we say thank you today. And God, would your generosity towards us be the basis of our generosity to others. Help us live that out this week. Help us trust you in this area of our life. In Jesus' name, amen.